The 3 years were not what people expect when I describe them. People expect devastation. People expect a woman sitting by a phone. People expect the specific hollowed-out quality of a parent who has been refused by a child and has organized her entire existence around the refusing. That is not what happened. What happened was that I decided on the drive home from the Italian restaurant that I was not going to allow Diane's management of my son to also manage my life. She had been given authority over his calendar and his calls and his presence at family events. She had not been given authority over who I was going to be in the years that followed. I threw myself into things, not as distraction, as genuine living. I took a watercolor class at the community center because a colleague mentioned it, and I had always wanted to try painting, and there had never been a reason to go alone before, and now alone was what I was, and alone was not the same as unable. I was terrible at watercolors for 3 months, and then I was mediocre, and then I was genuinely adequate, and I have 4 paintings on my wall that I made with my own hands, and they make me happy every morning. I traveled with a group from my church, twice, once to Portugal and once to Iceland. I stood in front of geysers and ancient tiles and ate food I had never eaten and talked to women my age who were also traveling without partners and who had the specific vivid quality of people who have decided that life continues regardless of what it has removed. I called Daniel once, in the first year, on his birthday. I left a voicemail that said, "Happy birthday, Daniel. I love you. I am here." He did not call back. I did not call again. Not because I had given up, because I had said what was true, and repeating it would not make it more true, and would make it less fun. I will not pretend that 3 years were without grief. There were evenings when the absence had a specific shape, and that shape was 30 years of dinners and phone calls and ordinary presence. And I sat with that grief, and I let it be what it was, and I did not make it the center of my life. It was a room in the house of my life. I knew it was there, I did not move in. And then, on a Thursday night at 11:47, my phone lit up with his name, and I answered, and he was in a driveway with his suitcases, and I held the phone and I made a decision that I had actually been making across 3 years without knowing it. The decision of who I was going to be when this moment arrived, because I had known somewhere that it would arrive. Mothers know things, even the ones whose sons have been told to stop calling. The restaurant was a place we had been to before, a quiet Italian place near his office, and when I sat across from him, I knew immediately that something was coming that he had prepared for. Daniel has never been a person who masks things well. He has his father's jaw and my eyes and the specific tell of a man who is carrying something difficult, which is that he becomes very still and very precise in his movements, the way people become still when they are managing something internally. He was very still. He ordered water. He did not look at the menu. He said, "Mom, I need to talk to you about something." I said, "Okay." I put my menu down. I gave him my full attention because full attention was what I had always given him, and it was not something I was going to perform differently because the conversation was going to be hard. He said, "Daniel feels that our relationship is too close." I said, "Our relationship?" He said, "Yours and mine." I said, "In what way?" He said, "She feels that you are too involved in our lives." I said, "Can you give me an example?" He looked at the table. He said, "She feels that I call you too often and that I share too much with you and that it creates a dynamic that makes her feel like a secondary priority." I looked at my son across a table in a quiet Italian restaurant and I thought about 19 years, about double shifts and soccer practice and Saturday mornings at the library, about the auditorium seats and the bleachers in the conferences and the ordinary Tuesdays, about the person he had become and the specific role I had played in the conditions of that becoming. And then I thought about Diane deciding that the mother who had done all of that was too close, and that close needed to be reduced to a distance Diane found comfortable. He said, "She has asked me to choose." I said, "I see." He said, "Mom, I love you." I said, "I know you do." He said, "I am choosing Diane." I said, "I know." I said it without anger, without tears, with the specific, composed dignity of a woman who has survived harder things than this, and who understands that her son making a wrong choice is still her son making a choice, and that children are allowed to make wrong choices, even when the cost of those choices is borne by the people who love them most. I said, "Daniel, I want you to know something." He looked up. I said, "I will always be your mother." I said, "I will not compete for that position." I said, "When you are ready to have me in your life as your mother, with conditions, I will be here." He said, "Mom." I said, "Let us have lunch." We ate lunch. It was the last time I saw him for 3 years. I need to tell you about raising Daniel before I tell you about losing him, because the losing only carries its full weight if you understand what I gave to the having. Daniel's father left when Daniel was 2, not dramatically, not with a scene or a confrontation. He simply became less present over a period of 6 months, and then one morning he was not there, and he did not come back. And what he left was a 2-year-old boy and a woman of 39 who had to decide very quickly what kind of mother she was going to be in the absence of the partner she had expected to do this with. I decided I was going to be the kind who showed up every time for everything, not because I was exceptional, but because Daniel was mine, and showing up was the only thing I knew how to do completely. I worked as an office manager for a medical practice for 26 years. I worked double shifts when school trips needed funding. I drove him to soccer practice and drama rehearsal and the library on Saturday mornings because he loved the library in the specific way of children who find books early and find in them the thing they did not know they were looking for. I attended every parent-teacher conference and every performance and every game, and I sat in those bleachers and those auditorium seats alone, and I did not feel the aloneness as a deficit. I felt it as a choice. He grew into a good man, thoughtful, careful, the kind of person who remembered details about people's lives and asked about them genuinely. I had done that, not alone, he had done it too, but I had given him the conditions in which that person could develop, and I was proud of that, quietly, and without requiring acknowledgement of it. He met Diane at 26. She was 24 and sharp and beautiful and had the specific self-assurance of a woman who understands exactly what she wants and is skilled at arranging circumstances to produce it. I noticed the self-assurance immediately. I thought it was confidence. I learned the difference between confidence and control slowly and too late to do anything about it while it was happening. The first year of their marriage was fine on the surface. Calls became less frequent, but I attributed that to the normal adjustment of a new marriage. Holidays were restructured, but I told myself that was reasonable. Sharing holidays between families required compromise, and compromise was natural. By the second year, I had become aware that the restructuring was not compromise. It was reduction. Every adjustment moved in one direction, which was away from me and toward a perimeter that Diane had been establishing since the beginning and that I had not named as a perimeter, because naming it would have required a conversation I was not sure Daniel was ready for. I was right about that. He was not ready. I found out exactly how not ready he was the day he asked me to meet him for lunch. My name is Margaret Calloway, and I am 61 years old. And I want to tell you about the phone call that came at 11:47 on a Thursday night, 3 years after my son told me he was choosing his wife over me. I want to start there because the phone call is the fulcrum of this story, and everything before it and everything after it only makes sense in relation to that moment. A phone ringing at 11:47. my son's name on the screen. 3 years of silence between that name and the last time I had heard his voice. I answered, because, of course, I answered. You can spend 3 years building a life that does not require a person and still answer when they call at midnight, because love does not operate on the same logic as self-protection, and I have never pretended otherwise. He said, Mom. I said, Daniel. His voice had the quality of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has finally arrived at the moment where holding it is no longer the right option. I said, Where are you? He said, I am in her driveway. He did not say her name. He did not need to. There was only one her in the context of 3 years of silence and a midnight phone call and a driveway. I said, What is in the trunk? He said, Everything I need right now. I want to pause here before I take you back to the beginning, because I need you to understand something about what I felt in that moment. I did not feel vindicated. I did not feel the satisfaction that the simple version of this story might suggest a mother would feel when the daughter-in-law who orchestrated her estrangement from her son has now apparently been left by that son in her own driveway. Before I tell you what I said to Daniel, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city in the comments. I love knowing where you are when you listen to this. Now, let me take you back to the restaurant where this story truly began. I did not tell him to come over that night. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where the mother immediately opens her arms and says, "Come home," is a version I understand, and a version that would have been available to me, and a version I consciously decided was not the right one. I said, "Daniel, I am glad you called." I said, "I want you to know that I love you, and that has not changed." I said, "Where are you going tonight?" He said, "I do not know." I said, "Call a friend." He said, "I do not have many left." I said, "I know." I said, "Call one anyway." I said, "We will talk tomorrow." He said, "Mom, are you angry with me?" I said, "No." I said, "I am not angry." I said, "I have had 3 years to not be angry, and I used them well." He was quiet. Then he said, "I am sorry." I said, "I know you are." I said, "We will talk about what sorry means when you've had some sleep." He said, "Okay." He said, "I love you." I said, "I love you too." I said, "Call me tomorrow." He said, "I will." He called at 9 the next morning. We talked for 2 hours, not about Diane specifically. That conversation came later when both of us were ready for it. We talked about the 3 years, about what they had looked like from his side and from mine, about Portugal and Iceland and watercolors, about what it had cost him to make the choice he made and what it had cost me to live with it. He said, "I knew it was wrong." He said, "I knew it when I was sitting at the restaurant, and I still did it because I did not know how to stand up to her, and I thought it would get better, and it did not get better." I said, "I know." He said, "How did you know?" I said, "Because I've been your mother for 38 years, and I know how you look when you are choosing something you're not sure about." He laughed. He said, "I am so sorry, Mom." I said, "Daniel, I forgive you." I said it with full intention, not as a performance, not as the closing of a transaction, as the genuine thing. We rebuilt slowly, the way things are rebuilt when the damage was real and the repair needs to be real too. Sunday dinners that started as phone calls and became actual dinners, visits that were brief at first and longer as the discomfort of the years between us dissolved into the familiarity of 38 years of being each other's people. He asked me once what I had wanted to say to him the night he called from the driveway that I did not say. I said, "I wanted to say, 'I told you so.'" He laughed. I said, "But I did not say it, because 'I told you so' is for people who need to be right more than they need to be kind, and I have never needed to be right that badly." He said, "You are the best person I know." I said, "I raised you to say that." He said, "No." He said, "You raised me to mean it." If you are a mother, sitting in 3 years of silence, wondering if the call is ever going to come, it may come, or it may not. Either way, you deserve a life that does not depend on the call. Build that life, fill it completely, And if the phone rings at 11:47 on a Thursday night and it's the person you gave everything to calling from a driveway with their suitcases, you will know exactly what to say because you will have spent 3 years becoming someone who does. That is my story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.